A podcast is an audio or video made available online for easy on-demand consumption and/or subscription-based delivery. That's the definition. Based on that definition, how many of you have ever listened to or watched a podcast? Probably half the room. How many of you have your own podcast? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 people. Okay. I'm so convinced of the power of a podcast that I have 4 of them. I Love Marketing, which is the first one. Genius Network Podcast, which features many of you. 10X Talk that I do with Dan Sullivan. And the Rich Cleaner podcast that we do for the cleaning niche. And soon to have Genius Recovery. These are all part of our marketing plan, and they're so vital for our growth at Genius Network. That's why I've hired Paul Colligan to basically manage all of our podcasts. To say that Paul is a podcasting genius is an understatement. If you were to look up the word podcast in the dictionary, you would see Paul's picture, if it was one of those picture dictionaries. In 2005, 2 years before the iPhone came out, and also the first year I ever actually published a podcast with Paul's help back then, Paul wrote the book that was titled The Business Podcasting Bible. That has been followed by 5 other books on podcasting. That's why Paul is the go-to man when it comes to podcasts. So I've asked Paul to focus on 2 specific things. 1, the power of a podcast for you, and 2, how a 10-minute talk at Genius Network can be leveraged into a podcast for crazy reach with my podcast network. So this is Paul's latest book, How to Podcast. He'll maybe talk about that. And the title is The Ridiculously Exponential Reach of a Podcast. Please help me welcome Paul Podcast Colligan. Thank you, brother. Thank you.
All right. This podcast was recorded in front of a live studio audience. All right. There I was. I was on the phone. Ideal client, who brought up the fact that they pay really well before we ever started negotiating. And she said those words everybody wants to hear. You know, Paul, I saw you a couple of years ago at Joe Polish's annual event. You see, it wasn't the first time this has ever happened. A lot of people have said they've seen me at a Joe Polish event. The interesting thing, the event in question was 1,764 days ago. 1,764 days ago, a presentation done at a 10-minute talk got me, or starting to get me, this next client. There I am on stage, about 40 pounds heavier, doing a little bit better. The shirt definitely could have been ironed. Was not my best presentation at all, but I wanted you to have your 5/21/2018. Now, let's do the numbers. There were less than 200 people in the room. Well, Joe puts everything on YouTube, doesn't he? You know, Joe has that big YouTube network. He's got all these fancy cameras. He's doing all that online video stuff, right? Yep. And this presentation is on YouTube, 468 views. More than twice as much as many people as were in the room. And that's good for me, and that's very good. But what's interesting is that presentation was also put on I Love Marketing. And last week when I put together these slides, 13,790 downloads of a presentation I did in front of a room than less than 200 people. And what's interesting is even though this is over 1,700 days old, that was the month of May. Every day in May, 5+ people are listening to this presentation that I did 1,700 days ago at Joe's presentation. Now, don't get me wrong. Mistakes were made. This was not my finest presentation by any touch of the imagination. But in 10 minutes, I reached tens of thousands of people and saw hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. Who'd like to see that? Raise your hand. See, that's the exponential power of a podcast. Now, they're Joe's podcast, but it's still the exponential power of a podcast. Now, I'm going to quote some of the greats here, Britney Spears. Oops, I did it again. And a couple of weeks ago on the Genius Network podcast was the presentation of my 10-minute talk that I did last year about stacking your deck. Some of you were here for that, some of you weren't, but the fact of the matter was I went on the Genius Network podcast. 16 days ago, when I took the stats, 192 people looked at it at YouTube, 2,962 people downloaded it on the podcast, at the average of 197 a day. Now that's going to go down a little bit, but 197 people a day hearing my message because I presented it in front of this group. Again, In this particular case, less than 50. That's the exponential power of a podcast. Now, it keeps getting bigger. Apple announced last week, it was the big worldwide developer conference, they announced that they had the first podcast with over 500 million downloads. No, it wasn't Tim Ferriss. It was How Stuff Works. The catalog of podcasts right now in the podcast catalog directory, 500,000 episodes. Podcasting. You want my secret? You want my client's secret? Because if you don't, I can go home. It's easy. Podcasting is not hacking the system. Those who are out there, oh, you do this, or you pay this, or you pay that person, or you play this little trick, and you can hack the system. Last week at WWDC, James Boggs, head of the business team, he said very clearly that they are retiring shows for people who are not playing by the rules. Retiring shows, that's the fancy word for you're out of here. Okay, podcasting is not about hacking the system. And podcasting is not really interviews and news. Most of us think, well, who do I interview? I actually had a gal post on my Facebook page once, I'm having a hard time finding interviews for my podcast. What do? I said, don't do an interview show. She responds, is that allowed? Okay, there's some of us who think podcasting is just interviews and news. It's not. Actually, of all the people in Genius Network who know the most about podcasting, it's Steve Sims. If communication isn't personal, it's not communication. Podcasting is an opportunity to have a personal conversation, one-to-many. Think about it. They take you on a car ride. You drive to work with them. They put you in the earbuds. They exercise with you. It's extremely intimate. Podcasting really is at its finest a shared conversation. Frank Kern, we're doing his show. We're having an absolute blast. Frank got in the car and did an episode called The One About Math. Frank Kern talking about math. Now, it's Frank. He can pull it off. But the fact of the matter is, Frank got in his car, put his iPhone in the holder, hit the record button, and said, hey, it's Frank. I just got done with this meeting. And then he talked about math for like 20 minutes. And it's amazingly compelling. It's absolutely wonderful. And it's Frank being Frank. And Frank has more charm than the rest of this room combined. But the fact of the matter is, it was just a conversation. There was no whiteboarding. There was no outlining. There was no nothing. It was just Frank being Frank because Frank shared an intimate conversation, and that's what podcasting is. And this is being downloaded by thousands and thousands of people as Frank becomes more and more hermit-like, okay? This is the exponential power of a podcast. I was at a little networking event, and there was another gentleman who would like to see as a podcasting client. And a couple days later, I got a text. I'll show you part of it. After trying a few podcasts, I like your style more than most. Many are too overproduced. So he's doing the research on what kind of podcasts he wants. We're talking about pre-selling, fantastic. If I wanted to listen to a 1930s radio drama, that's what I do. I don't need it in a podcast. He was doing his homework, and he said later on, this is what I'm hearing in your show. I like what you're doing. That's how it is. Fantastic stuff, exactly what you want. Is he prepared when we finally have the conversation? You bet he is, because my stuff's out there. A great conversation is timeless. A great conversation happened 1,763 days ago that is still seeing a return for me. Now, I get calls, many of you in this room, Paul, how do I become a great interviewer? See, you don't have to be a great interviewer to share a great conversation. And Joe will like these. You can be this guy. You can be this guy. You can actually be this guy. Our own Peter Vondere. Peter, where are you? Raise your hand. Get over Peter, quickly. That's only 10 minutes. Peter has a show, Behind the Bricks. It's about the thing that we're all in, the Manhattan residential family, $10 to $50 million real estate business. I mean, it's as niche as it gets. But the fact of the matter was, he had a conversation with the FBI lead international kidnapping negotiator for 24 years. When I tell that to people, nobody says, well, how are his interview skills? How is the fidelity of the information? This guy got to talk to the lead FBI kidnapping negotiator for more than 2 decades. Yes, bet that was incredible. Yeah, it was. And does that guy know a little bit about negotiation? And is that something relevant to the world of high-stakes real estate? You absolutely bet it is. So your content doesn't have to be amazing. Your content just has to be relevant. Raise your hand in this room if you have relevant content. Okay, so you have a conversation. You've got 2 choices. You can have that conversation, or you can have that conversation. Really, it's the same conversation, it's just different tech. But let's chat about the numbers of the tech. 1 10-minute talk, less than 200 people in the room, 13,790 downloads of the podcast. That doesn't even include the YouTube stuff. 6+ today, 6+ tomorrow. How many more clients? And it's not even my podcast. And I'm going to keep doing it. Heck, I'm doing it right now. And you should keep doing it. Now, what if I told you there was a worksheet called 7 Elements of a Presentation Worth Podcasting? Who'd be interested in that worksheet? Everybody in the room gets a copy of that worksheet when this is done, and you'll get a copy of the slides as well. If you are watching this on the podcast, or you're listening to this on the podcast, you can text the word network to 503-966-8066. We'll get you that worksheet. Yeah, you see what I'm doing right here. Yeah. And we're called, building a list. Again, everybody in the room, you're going to get a copy of this when this is over. But text network to 503-966-8066. Who would like the power of a podcast without ever plugging in a microphone? Okay, just you. We'll chat afterwards. 3 options. Number 1, your amazing 10-minute talk on Joe's network. I did it 1,700 days ago. I did it last year. I'm doing it right now. This is your option. Number 2 is just get your own show. You can do that. Number 3, my favorite, your amazing 10-minute talk on Joe's network that promotes your own show. Hey, world, you should subscribe to the podcast report with Paul Colligan. See what I just did there? All right, you text network to 503-966-8066 for the checklist. So I want you to do 2 things. Number 1, I want you to strategically share a conversation via podcast. Number 2, I want you to enjoy the results. I open with a story, me on the phone with someone who I wanted to have as a client. The marketing was already done because she saw my presentation, my shared conversation. That is the exponential power